Hello everyone, and a warm welcome back to our Evolution and Ecology seminar series. My name is Elizabeth Duxbury and I'm a postdoc in the research group of Alexei Maklikov at the University of East Anglia in the UK, and I'll be hosting today's session. As always, there will be a Q&A session directly after the talk, so please post your questions in the dedicated Slack channel and upvote questions that you'd like to hear. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Lutz Fromhage, Academy Research Fellow in Evolutionary Biology at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. Lutz's research explores the evolutionary causes and consequences of a diverse range of life history traits by using innovative mathematical and computational modeling approaches to simulate and generate novel evolutionary theory. A particular focus of Lutz's research addresses the evolution of reproductive traits, such as mating strategies and sex allocation, and Lutz notably co-authored a landmark Nature paper on the co-evolution of choosiness and cooperation, as well as exploring fascinating topics including the links between lifespan and learning ability, and also the occurrence of sexual cannibalism in spiders. More recently, Lutz has provided a curious twist on inclusive fitness theory with a reconsideration of the role of an organism's social environment on their fitness, which brings us neatly onto the intriguing title for the work Lutz will present today, The Meaning of Life, Biologically Speaking. So Lutz, thank you for accepting our invitation, and over to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure. When we look around the natural world, we see striking examples of apparent design and purpose everywhere. We explain these observations with Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. But nature is so diverse that one could almost get the impression that anything is possible in evolution. And this raises the question, what does evolutionary theory actually predict about the adaptive design of organisms? And to get you thinking about this question, I want to start off by playing a short natural history quiz with you. So if you're watching this on the live stream, you can actively participate with your phone. So if you are up to do that, then grab your phone now and use it to go to the website www.kahoot.it. Kahoot.it is the website. And I'll repeat that in a bit. Then you will have to enter a game pin, which I will show in a moment. Then you have to press the button with the label spin, which will create automatically a nickname for you, and then press OK, go to enter the game. So I'll say once more the name of the website. It's www.kahoot.it. And now when you have your phone, when you have the site open on your phone, you can enter the PIN, which is 14160007. And I can see now how people appear. So far there's two. I'll say it again. The game PIN is 14160007. Give it a little bit of time. There's a limit to 50 participants. Okay, now they're coming. So if you don't get in, if there's more than 50 who want to participate, then don't worry. You can just watch and guess along all the same. But of course, it'll be more fun if you're active. Let's see. I'll give it a few more seconds. I think I have that time. Maybe wait for 40. So kahoot.it 14160007. Okay, maybe we can do the 50. Oh, one dropped out. Okay, maybe I'll continue. 42 is a good number. Okay. Anyway, you can still keep joining as I go. So I will always ask you the same question. And the question is, which organism is adapted to pursue this life goal? Life goals will vary, and then you can pick from the options. So the first life goal is attach to a piece of rock and digest your own brain. One of these organisms you can see here on the pictures is adapted to pursue that life goal. Now, make your pick, and then on your phone, touch the field with the same color corresponding to the answer you picked, and that's how you enter your answer. Okay, that's already 20 answers here. Anyway, Let's see, most people were for this last creature. Let's see. That was indeed the correct answer. That was a sea squirt, which is a marine animal, which in its larval stage looks roughly like a tadpole, and then it grows up to become a sessile, brainless adult. Next question, same principle. We have leaderboard. Which organism is adapted to live for thousands of years? There's a 20-second time limit on each question, so you gotta be quick. Okay, now most people, huge majority, got that one right. This is a bristlecone pine, and they are probably the oldest species on Earth. They get up to 5,000 years old. So these trees here, they were already around when the Egyptians started building pyramids. Next one. Which organism is adapted to be prettier than its rivals? Okay, maybe I should have given more time, but that's what it is now. So here the correct answer was a male bird of paradise, which as an adult looks like this with very showy feathers, which are attractive to females. I have a few more. Excited dragon leads. Which organism is adapted to get eaten by a female? Okay, yeah, huge majority, only one was off. That, of course, was a male redback spider, which has a very bizarre mating behavior. Not only does it get eaten by the female, it actually makes an active movement to basically throw itself into the female's mouth parts to actively bring about its demise. Next question. Which organism is adapted to lay 20,000 eggs daily? Maybe that was a bit more difficult. Yeah, almost split between the last two options. Here, the correct answer was a termite queen. This is what she looks like when she's young. So she has wings, but then after mating, she sheds the wings and then essentially turns herself into an egg-laying machine and pumps out eggs every few seconds, then for decades ever after. Yeah. One more question for now. Which organism is adapted to become a living food storage container? Okay, that's also, majority is also right here. So here the correct answer was a worker honeypot ant. And here you can see some of these ants completely filled with honey and hanging motionless on the roof of their nest and just serving as a food storage device. And I should add that, as usual for the workers in social insects, these individuals are completely sterile, so they never produce any own offspring. Now, at this point, let's take a moment to reflect on our theory for explaining this diversity. A key feature of Darwin's theory is that it invokes a tendency for cumulative improvement. In Darwin's own words, natural selection is daily and hourly working at the improvement of each organic being in relation to its organic and inorganic conditions of life. I want to make 2 points about this. Firstly, this cumulative improvement is really crucial to explaining complex and well-adapted organisms. Creationists sometimes point out that a tornado in a junkyard will never, by sheer accident, end up assembling a Boeing 747. Their point being that the shaping of organisms by evolution is supposed to be equally unlikely. But they are wrong about this precisely because of this tendency for cumulative improvement, which operates in evolution, but not in junkyard tornadoes. The second point I want to make is that the very idea of improvement implies the existence of some criterion by which improvement can be judged. Let me try to illustrate this with a metaphor. In his book, Climbing Mount Improbable, Richard Dawkins described adaptive evolution as a slow climbing process towards outcomes that would otherwise seem unlikely. But for evolution to climb Mount Improbable in this way, there must be some way of telling which way is up, metaphorically speaking. In other words, inherent in natural selection, there must be some abstract criterion of good phenotypic design. And this brings us back to our quiz. If there is an abstract and general criterion of good phenotypic design inherent in natural selection, then this should be manifested in all the organisms we have looked at so far. So let's take another look at them and ask the question, which gives double points if you care about the leaderboard. What general life goal do they all have in common? Is it survival of the species? Is it each individual's own survival and reproduction? Is it to spread their genes by reproducing and or helping relatives? Or is it to spread their genes by means that don't rely on others' help? I've given you more time for this question because this is the crucial one. And if you can figure this one out for yourself with confidence, then you're already halfway towards the take-home message of my talk. If everyone answers, then it progresses automatically, but otherwise we still wait 5 seconds. Okay, let's see. Interesting result. Okay. Almost nobody likes survival of the species. Also not very popular, spread genes by means that don't rely on others' help. Quite popular is own survival and reproduction, and the most popular is spread genes by reproducing and or helping relatives. Okay, nice. That helps me in my narrative, as you will see. So let's go through the possible answers and let me comment on them. So survival of the species is wrong for many reasons, but I'm just going to give one. If we look at the bird of paradise's showy feathers, they increase the risk of predation, and this doesn't aid the survival of the species. So that can't be right. If we look at own survival and reproduction, that was pretty popular among you, but that can't be right either because a worker honeypot ant never reproduces. And the third option was to spread genes by reproducing and or helping relatives. This is what I will argue is the correct option, and I'll elaborate on that quite a bit. Stay tuned. And finally, spread genes by means that don't rely on others' help. Can't be right either, because, for example, a termite queen depends completely on her workers' help. So if we didn't count the offspring she produces with the help of workers, we would have to conclude that a termite queen has no reproductive success at all. Right, I hope up to here it sounds pretty plausible to you, and you might even think that this is all really basic material, introductory textbook material that has all been sorted out many decades ago. But perhaps surprisingly, the conclusion I have just drawn from this quiz question here stands in direct contradiction to some of the most influential work in this field. How can that be? Let me explain, starting from the beginning. Let's remind ourselves of the basics of natural selection. We can think of natural selection as roughly analogous to trial and error learning. New gene variants are like different ways to solve a problem. They arise by mutation, and then they spread if they change the phenotype of an organism in ways that aid the gene's propagation. They cause something to happen that solves the problem. We can then ask, what kinds of organisms will successful genes contribute to build? Bill Hamilton made a major breakthrough in answering this question in the 1960s when he developed his theory of inclusive fitness. Hamilton distinguished two causal pathways by which a gene can aid its propagation. The direct fitness pathway works by increasing a focal individual's own reproduction, and the indirect fitness pathway works by increasing the reproduction of others who carry the gene's identical copies. Hamilton summarized his insight by defining inclusive fitness as a combined measure of direct and indirect fitness. The full definition is a bit long, but I'm going to read it to you anyway, at least the most part of it. According to Hamilton, inclusive fitness is the personal fitness which an individual actually expresses once it is stripped of all components which can be considered as due to the individual's social environment, then augmented by certain fractions of the quantities of harm and benefit which the individual himself causes to the fitnesses of his neighbors. I want to focus on the red part here, stripped of all components which can be considered as due to the individual's social environment. What is that about? Let me explain with a cartoon model. Here we have two organisms. Each alone makes two babies shown as little circles. Think of yourself as the blue focal individual. Now, if you help the other individual, you cause it to produce an extra offspring, the little square. But this is at cost C to your own output of one fewer offspring. Now, in this example, your inclusive fitness, here denoted IF Hamilton, would be your baseline fitness, 2 in this example, minus the cost of helping, plus the indirect fitness benefit of helping, which is R times B, where R is relatedness. So far, so good. But now, since you are expressing a helping gene and are interacting with the relative might also have this gene and help you in return. This possibility is indicated by the red arrow. So now you have some probability of producing an extra offspring, the little red square. And that is the kind of offspring that was excluded by the red stripping part of Hamilton's definition that you saw on the previous slide. Why did Hamilton exclude it? Why is the red B not present in the expression for inclusive fitness? The reason is that this ensures that both the cost and the benefit of helping are counted exactly once in this expression. And that leads to a condition that predicts selection for helping correctly when helping increases inclusive fitness above the baseline. And the common form to write this condition is Hamilton's rule. Okay, by contrast, if we don't exclude the red B and the red square, then we run into a problem known as double accounting. In that case, a new term appears here in the expression for inclusive fitness, where F is the probability of receiving help, and FB is the amount of help you can expect to receive on average. Now, this no longer corresponds to Hamilton's definition, so we should give it a different name. And I want to call it the folk definition of inclusive fitness, or IFOC for short. And I call it that because this is what biologists often come up with when you ask them to define inclusive fitness from memory. It's what you get when you simply forget about this counterintuitive stripping part from Hamilton's original definition. Now, the problem with this folk definition is that it appears to predict selection for helping wrongly. And it does so because it includes a benefit, the red B, whose cost, the yellow C, is unaccounted for. And if you count only the benefit part and not the cost part of helping, you're getting a biased estimate. So that is why theoreticians have rejected this folk definition. But now we have a problem. On the one hand, we have your majority vote, represented here by the termite queen, which suggests that offspring produced with the help from others should count. And on the other hand, we have Hamilton's definition, which denies this. So who's right here? To get to the bottom of this, I want to draw attention to two problematic assumptions in Hamilton's theory. And these are the assumptions of additive causality and the assumption that an arbitrary gene can act as a stand-in for the genome as a whole. Let's first look at additive causality. What is that? Hamilton assumed in his model that the total effect of multiple causes is simply the sum of the partial effects of the individual causes on their own, without any interaction terms. So for example, this would mean that if someone helps you, then the magnitude of the effect of this help is independent of the phenotype that you yourself are expressing. In other words, you are assumed to have zero control over the birth of those of your offspring, here the red square, which Hamilton's definition wants to exclude. Now, if the red square arises no matter what you do and no matter what phenotype you express, then it is merely a constant that becomes irrelevant to the question of what phenotype will maximize your inclusive fitness. So therefore, excluding this red square is unproblematic if causality is indeed additive, as Hamilton assumed. If you can't influence the red square, excluding it makes no difference to what phenotype maximizes your inclusive fitness. Now, this solves part of the puzzle because termite queens clearly have many traits that will have some effect on how many offspring they can produce with a given amount of help. For example, as I put it in the mouth of this termite queen, without my huge ovaries, I couldn't make the most of this help that I'm getting here. So how many offspring are produced with a given helping act is not only a function of the help itself. In general, it depends also on the phenotype of the recipient. And if that is the case, then we would miss this effect if we are simply neglecting these offspring that were caused due to the social environment. And that is why Hamilton's assumption of additive causality is violated, and therefore his theory, strictly speaking, simply doesn't apply to these kind of situations. But now we still have one other problem, which is this double accounting problem I mentioned earlier, which appeared to suggest that red squares must be excluded. So what's that about? And the solution I'm going to offer for this is that this double accounting problem doesn't actually arise if we are careful to distinguish between causal effects and correlational effects. As empiricists well know, the gold standard way of measuring a causal effect is to do a controlled experiment. That is to conduct a targeted intervention and compare it to an appropriate control. So for example, if we're interested to measure a helping gene's causal effect in this kind of situation where there might be mutual helping, then the proper way to do it, theoretically, is to compare this situation with an otherwise identical situation where the helping gene is silenced in the focal individual. Therefore, the helping gene being silenced, there is no cost arising, there's no helping, there's no indirect benefit arising. So in this case, the focal organism's folk value will just be the baseline plus the help received. And now the helping gene's causal effect can be measured as the difference it makes between expressing and not expressing this helping gene. And it turns out that when this difference is positive, we recover Hamilton's rule. So the helping gene's causal effect does predict selection, and there's no need to exclude any offspring a priori. Now, let's turn to the second problematic assumption in Hamilton's theory. This is the assumption that an arbitrary gene can act as a stand-in for the genome as a whole. Hamilton used the concept of inclusive fitness in two ways. On the one hand, he used it as a genetic accounting tool to predict selection for a focal gene. He predicted that a focal gene would be selected for if expressing the gene increases an organism's inclusive fitness. But then he also suggested that inclusive fitness is what I want to call a phenotypic maximum, that is, a quantity which an organism shaped by natural selection should be adapted to maximize. And the connection here is that the maximum property follows logically from the accounting tool property if successive positively selected genes always shape phenotypic evolution in the same direction, namely towards increased inclusive fitness. In other words, genes need to pull in the same direction. But is this necessarily a justified assumption? No, it is not. Let's look at this example here where helping is extremely efficient, so that at the cost of only one of your own offspring, you can help your sibling, let's assume that's your sibling, you can help your sibling produce 10 extra nieces or nephews. Will a gene spread that induces this behavior? What do you think? Let's take your answer in Kahoot. Is helping between siblings selected for in this situation where at the cost of one of your own offspring, you induce your sibling to make 10 extra nieces or nephews? Yes, no, it depends, don't know. It depends, yes still wins. Okay, the correct answer is it depends. It depends on what happens when two individuals try to help each other. For example, one possibility is that there could be some interference between matching phenotypes that eliminates the benefits of mutual helping. For example, if you think of an extreme example of two worker honeypot ants helping each other, nobody reproduces, no offspring are being produced. So this is a possibility. And if we're talking about a helping gene that is being expressed in every individual that has this gene, that then in that case, the huge benefits of unilateral helping will only accrue to those siblings who don't have the focal helping gene. And so far as the helping gene is concerned, benefits that accrue only to relatives who don't have this gene count for nothing. So if we're considering the selection on a helping gene that is always expressed, then selection is against helping in this example. But on the other hand, genes are not always expressed. There are at least two mechanisms that can prevent a gene from being simultaneously expressed in interacting relatives. The first possibility is called low penetrance. So if a gene has a low probability of being expressed in any given organism, then an organism who expresses the gene will mostly interact with others who don't express it, even if they have it. And the second possibility is conditional expression. Genes can be expressed conditional on some asymmetry between individuals. For example, if you have a helping gene for helping your younger sibling, conditional on being the older, then your younger sibling will not return the favor by expressing the same gene. So if either of these mechanisms is in play, we get selection for helping in this example. For example, a gene for helping your younger sibling would be positively selected because it generates the large benefit of unilateral helping every time it is expressed. So, is helping selected for or against? If opposite phenotypes are selected for based on different genes, how can we predict phenotypic evolution? Our proposed solution has 3 steps. First, we invoke the principle that long-term evolution follows the genome's majority interest. A great metaphor for this is the parliament of genes. Second, we introduce the idea of a reference gene that is a theoretical tool for characterizing the genome's majority interest. And thirdly, we suggest that inclusive fitness should be redefined as the quantity whose maximization best serves the genome's majority interest. Let's start with the parliament of genes. This was first proposed in the 1970s by Egbert Lee to explain the fact that fair meiosis is very common, despite the fact that segregation-distorted genes that bias meiosis in their favor can enjoy a huge selective advantage. Lee wrote, "It is as if we had to do with a parliament of genes. Each acts in its own self-interest, but if its acts hurt others, they will combine together to suppress it." In other words, Lee explained the rarity of segregation-distorted genes with the principle that traits that oppose the genome's majority interest are eliminated by counter-selection at other loci. Another classic idea is that we can think of organisms as vehicles for gene propagation. In the words of Richard Dawkins, we are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. We take this idea one step further by suggesting that we can define and measure an organism's vehicle quality as its general capacity to propagate its genes and their identical copies. How do we measure this vehicle quality? Well, we propose to measure it by counting the number of copies of a reference gene that are causally attributable to an organism, that are caused to come into existence by a focal organism. And here the reference gene is a hypothetical gene with idealized properties. And it is aimed to provide the ideal reference or stand-in for the genome's majority interest. The reference gene has 4 properties. It is present in the focal organism, rare in the population, subject to Mendelian inheritance, and rarely or never expressed. Here, the first 2 properties are there to facilitate measurement. We simply count copies of the reference gene to measure vehicle quality. And the last 2 properties are there to exclude mechanisms of gene propagation that would be counter-selected by other loci. Okay, let's go through one example of how we would calculate or measure the vehicle quality of a focal organism. Without breeding, any given offspring of a focal individual will on average carry 0.5 copies of the reference gene. And offspring of a relative of degree R will on average carry 0.5 times R copies of the reference gene. Own offspring are a special case of this, for which R equals 1. If we take the sum over all relatives, including the focal individual, we can say that the total number of reference gene copies is given by this expression. And now, if we drop the constant 0.5 and also exclude any offspring of relatives that were not causally affected by our focal organism, then we can say that the focal organism's vehicle quality will be maximized by expressing the phenotype that maximizes this expression here. Here, the delta indicates that we count only changes in offspring production that were in fact caused by our focal individual. So, expressed in words, this can be read as the focal individual's own offspring plus effects on relatives' number of offspring weighted by relatedness. Note that this includes all of the focal individual's own offspring. Nothing is being stripped away, nothing is being excluded. It doesn't matter if these own offspring were produced with or without the help of others in the social environment. So therefore, this actually recovers our old friend, the folk definition, inclusive fitness, as I've already put it here. Okay, apart from its intuitive appeal, we have 2 main arguments to suggest that this inclusive fitness, according to the folk definition, is the correct phenotypic maximum that is relevant to natural selection. The first argument is about evolutionary stability, and the second argument is about cumulative change. Let's start with evolutionary stability. I'm now going to show you a logical proof that at evolutionary stability, the strategy must maximize an organism's inclusive fitness according to the folk definition. And this is a logical proof by contradiction based on 3 premises. The premises are: 1, the population is at an evolutionary equilibrium. So this means that no mutant gene can be selected for by encoding an alternative strategy. 2, genes with any degree of penetrance can encode any mutant strategy. And 3, the current strategy does not maximize IF-folk. Now, if the last 2 premises are true, it follows that there is the scope for a new mutation to arise that would increase the IF-folk of the organisms expressing this gene, because it's not already maximized, so there is some scope to increase it. And this gene could also satisfy our definition of a reference gene. And since we have defined IF-folk in terms of a reference gene's propagation success, a reference gene whose causal effect is to increase IF-folk is guaranteed to be selected for by definition. Hence, there is selection for a mutant phenotype, and this contradicts the premise that the population was at an evolutionary equilibrium. It follows that if premises 1 and 2 are true, then premise 3 must be false. In other words, no phenotypic strategy can be evolutionarily stable unless the organisms adopting it maximize their inclusive fitness. Great, we have a logical proof, case closed, right? Or not? Unfortunately not, because as you might know, real populations are rarely in complete equilibrium. So this is the artificial situations here, and therefore it's still worth looking at our second argument about cumulative change. I want you to envisage a mutant gene that has some phenotypic effect that increases the vehicle quality of an organism through some mechanism that is initially inefficient. Why inefficient? Because new mutations and new adaptations haven't been perfected yet by natural selection. Now, that gives some scope then for other genes that are unlinked to the first to also increase vehicle quality and become selected for by increasing the efficiency of the mechanism induced by the first gene. And in this way, successive unlinked genes can make cumulative contributions that push phenotypic evolution in the same direction, namely towards increased vehicle quality or equivalently towards increased folk definition inclusive fitness. Of course, genes that decrease vehicle quality or inclusive fitness will sometimes be selected for example, those induced by a segregation distorter gene, but we assume that those kind of genes will in the long run be selected against by counter-selection acting on the rest of the genome. Time to summarize. We started with the question, what are organisms adapted to achieve? We followed Hamilton's lead in trying to identify a phenotypic maximum, that is, a quantity which an organism shaped by natural selection should be adapted to maximize. We saw that Hamilton's original definition doesn't generally work as a maximum because it neglects an important part of reproductive success. The folk definition, on the other hand, not only avoids this problem, but it also explains the cumulative improvement of organisms as guided by the genome's majority interest that presumably is responsible for all these fancy and well-adapted and complex forms that we see all around us in nature. Finally, my take-home message in cartoon format, we suggest that there are 2 useful metaphors for thinking about phenotypic evolution. We can put ourselves in the shoes of a reference gene and ask the question, what phenotype should I encode to maximize my number of copies? Or alternatively, but equivalently, we can adopt the perspective of an individual organism and ask, what phenotype should I express to propagate my genes or equivalently maximize my inclusive fitness according to the folk definition? And either way, we ask the question, the answer to this question should be the phenotype that we should organisms expect to express if they are optimally adapted to their environment. I will leave the last word to Hamilton with a quote that shows that Hamilton himself, unlike some of his followers, appears to have been aware of the limitations of his definition of inclusive fitness. He wrote, "Perhaps we should not feel entirely confident about generalizing our principle until a more comprehensive mathematical argument with inclusive fitness more widely defined has been worked out. But even from this point of view, there does seem to be good reason for thinking that it can be generalized. This leaves me to thank my co-author with this work, Mike Jenians, and my funding body, the Academy of Finland. And here's the paper, if you want to read up more about this. Actually, the paper, because it was a bit controversial and also not very easy to get it through peer review, the paper has an appendix that has a very long Q&A section with about 40 questions and answers. But of course, I'm curious if you can think of any new ones, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Lutz, for a very fascinating and thought-provoking talk. And I think you did an excellent job of explaining with quite sparkling clarity a lot of the complexities behind this new mathematical modeling and theory approach to inclusive fitness. So we're going to move on to the Q&A session now. And some questions are starting to come in from the audience. But I thought I would start with a question of my own first. And thank you also for the interactive aspect of your presentation. I think that was a very novel way to engage the audience. So I had a question about when you were talking about the problems with the assumptions of Hamilton's theory related to inclusive fitness. And you talked about how using an arbitrary gene as a stand-in for the genome is obviously not always the case. And I was curious how genomic conflict could interplay with this, because obviously sometimes kind of the interests of some genes differ from those of others, and this conflict between genes obviously would mean that the organism as a whole wouldn't be like a consistent part, if that makes sense. I wonder if you could talk more about in this context.
Yeah, so genomic complexity is really relevant to this, because what we're trying to get at with this reference gene approach is to get like a shortcut to what would happen if the genome is really complex, and there can be many different things going on at different loci, and you can have some genes that have high penetrance, some that have low penetrance, some with conditional expression, some with unconditional expression, and this gets quickly too complex to do it like analytically with analytical mathematics. But of course you can do it with simulations, and that's what we also have done. And what we have found is that what you need to include is basically sufficient flexibility in the genetic system as a whole to have the potential for gradual evolution. So then there can be genes with big or small effects all put together, but there have to be some with small effects also in the mix. And as long as that is the case, then we always get, at least in the cases we looked at, we get a selection towards these equilibriums where this folk definition inclusive fitness is maximized. Whereas if you don't include this complexity, and you just do the usual thing that is done in classical population genetics theory, you just take one gene with two alleles, then you can very easily get to an equilibrium where this inclusive fitness is not maximized. But we would argue that's actually an artifact of the overly simplistic genetics. And if you put in some more realistic amount of genomic and genetic complexity, then there tends to be the potential for gradual evolution. And that's exactly how the cumulative improvement mechanism comes in. And then we get these outcomes where inclusive fitness is maximized.
Great, thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer. It makes sense, and it's great to see that the complexity is incorporated into the simulation approach to more accurately reflect the biological reality. So we have a question from the audience, which asks, in the cumulative change situation, do these secondary initially unlinked genes become linked to the IF gene they enhance? And a follow-up to that is, does the situation change if they're costly, if expressed in the background not including the IF gene?
Let me first answer the first part. So
yeah, sure.
Of course, the schematic explanation that I gave, there was no linkage there. And in the simulations that I described, there was also no linkage there. So I guess that's another thing you could include, but it's at least not necessary. Even if they remain unlinked, they pull in the same direction, even when they're unlinked. So it's a good question. Will there be selection for linkage? I guess initially, at least, there will be if they are really mutually reinforcing, but that's not really what the key idea here is, because here the key idea is that even when they're unlinked, as most genes across the genome will tend to be, then they still have a tendency to mostly pull in one particular direction, and that's towards at least increased inclusive fitness of the organism. Yeah, what was the second part of the question? Sorry.
Yeah, so the second part asks, does the situation change if they're costly if expressed in a background not including the IF gene? I guess this is referring to.
Yeah. Okay. If they were costly if the IF gene were, I mean, there wasn't really an IF gene in this. I know what the questioner means. So,
yeah.
So, if one gene is rare and is doing something inefficient, but is still positively selected, and another gene arises that would be positive, have a positive effect in that genetic background, but not in all other backgrounds, then if this first gene was still rare, then the other gene would be counter-selected, because it would be quite unlikely, unless it was linked to the first, in the beginning, it would tend to occur in other backgrounds, where then, according to this cost assumption, it would be counter-selected, and then it would might get lost again. So in that case, the situation would change, at least in the way that there will be more selection for linkage, and also, I don't know, maybe one has to wait for another gene then that doesn't induce costs and is still doing something positive when combined with the first gene.
Great, thank you. That's very interesting. So I had another question of my own, which also relates to the problems with Hamilton's assumptions, and something I was thinking about related to the additive causality points that you were talking about. I was wondering how something like competitive altruism could play into this. So, for example, if an individual was more or less likely to get help in producing offspring from another individual based on some traits of its phenotype, which were related to perhaps how cooperative the individual was. Do you think this could help?
Sorry, I lost you there. So,
sorry. Yeah.
One individual is more likely to get offspring from another, or to help it to produce offspring, or in which sense get offspring from the other?
Yeah, so if an individual is more likely to get help in producing offspring, if that first individual is altruistic in its behavior, do you think this could play into the inclusive fitness model? So could that enhance the number of offspring that the first individual gets from help, as well as just its own offspring, if that makes sense?
Yeah. There are models about this, and so in principle, this can work. That if your altruism is then noticed by others and then gives you some benefit, that they will be more likely to cooperate with you, or less likely to break up the connection with you, then there can be selection for this trait. And this would actually show up in the direct fitness part here, unless this is again between relatives. But this can work also between non-relatives, but it's fully compatible with this framework. So this maximization of inclusive fitness, it has these two components, direct and indirect fitness, and this would be a component where, by being altruistic, you actually get some help back through some other causal pathways, which shows up in your own offspring being more than otherwise.
Great, thank you. Perfect. So we have another question from the audience, which asks, so the examples you gave were all species level traits, but the mechanism you elucidated will act only locally, i.e. at the population level. And so have you explored how geographic selection mosaics and gene flow will affect adaptation?
No, I haven't. So there's a great modeling industry in modeling spatially explicit situations where the spatial structure affects the relatedness. But what we're here doing is we're looking at like pedigree relatedness. So we interpret relatedness not as some correlation between some likelihood of sharing the same allele at one particular locus, which is what is often done in modeling, that you think that you say, when you say relatedness, you just mean relatedness at one locus, and it can be completely different at other loci. We actually mean pedigree relatedness just between first degree relatives, 0.5, second degrees, 0.25, etc. So, of course, the geographic spatial setting will also affect how likely you are to meet your blood relatives as defined with a pedigree relatedness definition. But we haven't done any explicit models about that. But of course, I assume that, I'm confident that if you would model spatial scenarios where these kind of probabilities of meeting relatives change, then this will also affect selection in a way that should be consistent with this framework that I was talking about.
Great, thank you. So I was thinking, in terms of the wider implications of this new kind of rewriting of the standard definition of inclusive fitness that was proposed by Hamilton. So I guess my question is related to applications or biological examples where it can be tested to play out, perhaps. Yeah, like in practice in the field. I was just wondering if you could talk more about the implications of the models.
I think in practice it's not going to make that big a difference, because most biologists think in those terms anyway. They just cite Hamilton for that and then don't realize that there's some inconsistency there. So I think a lot of research just can carry on as it has been, but there's still work to be done to tie up all the loose ends, because, for example, when people talk about Hamilton's rule, for most theoreticians, this means a rule that applies to, that says something about selection for a focal gene, but behavioral ecologists, they usually mean that there's something that applies to the causal effects of actions of organisms. So there's still some ambiguity there that has to do with this issue, and that needs to be clarified. But I think for empirical work, there's at least a lot of work that can continue in the usual way, but that has an actual justification now, because until now you could always meet a theoretician who tells you, oh yeah, actually you're defining inclusive fitness wrong, and then you would be embarrassed and, I don't know, write about, we're just taking the gene's eye view and we're actually not talking about organisms, we're just talking about selection for one gene, and maybe that gets you out of the trouble. But we don't have to do that if we are defining inclusive fitness in this way.
Brilliant, thank you. Is it unusual actually, because I guess often it's the other way around. So rather than the textbooks writing what the real situation is like, it's that almost there's been a misinterpretation of Hamilton's rule to some extent, which is what people have been using, but you've now very elegantly proved how mathematically it could work in terms of, I guess, what people initially were not quite interpreting Hamilton correctly, I guess. Yeah,
we actually wrote it like that in our paper, that now it's the situation that the textbooks need to have it right, and the experts need to be corrected. But of course, some people who worked with a particular way of doing things for decades, some people are hostile to this, because they don't want to be faced with a new way of thinking about this. So it'll still be to be seen how this plays out in the long run. But at least for me, it's clarified a lot of things.
Definitely. Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. So I'm just looking, we don't have any more questions at the moment coming in from our audience. A few may come in at a later date, so if you would like to look at the Slack channel later on and answer any additional questions, you'd be more than welcome. I'm sure people would appreciate that. Great. So I think yeah, that's about all we have time for today, but it is our great pleasure to thank you once again, Lutz, for a very fascinating and thought-provoking talk. Thank you.
Thanks, it was an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you. So I'd like to remind everyone, just before we finish, that our next talk in this series will take place next Wednesday and will be presented by Professor Hoppy Hoekstra on the genetic and developmental basis of adaptation. So we hope that you can join us then, same time and same place. And in the meantime, check out our updates on Slack and our Twitter feeds and spread the word about our seminars. Thanks for taking part, and until next time, stay safe and see you again soon. Goodbye.